My name is Paul Rozier. I teach in the history department and I serve as the director of the LePage Center for History in the Public Interest. And I'm delighted to have Aaron Bentley with us today to share a really important story, a local story. We've been spending a lot of time this semester talking about climate change from a global perspective. And today we're going to bring it home to our local environs. I wanted to say thank you for your attendance at this semester's events on climate change. On Title IX, we've had a range of other events that we're really proud of. In the spring, we're going to be having 3 additional panels on climate change, one on national security, one on climate migration, and one on cities. In addition to some professional development seminars, including one on how to write an op-ed that I'm going to encourage everyone to attend so that we can take some of this historical knowledge and channel it into various media outlets. Now I'd like to turn it over to Kevin Fox, the center administrator, who's going to mention an additional event that's coming up in the spring, and then he will introduce Trip Wright, who is going to moderate today's discussion. Kevin?
Hi, I'm Kevin Fox. I'm the Center Administrator for the Upper LePage Center for History in the Public Interest. Wanted to mention that in late March, we're going to have an event about Haiti, the Haitian Revolution, and Haitian relationship diplomatically with France and the U.S. and the Western world at large. It's going to be moderated by Dr. Morgan Keita, and we'll be featuring speakers from Yale, Vanderbilt, and Howard University. More information to come. There'll be marketing and advertising, but in the meantime, look forward to that. This event today will be moderated by Trip Wright, one of my graduate fellows. He's a second-year graduate student here in Villanova's history program. After completing his Bachelor of Arts in History at Trinity University and working as a rock climbing instructor for some time, Trip came to Villanova to continue his academic journey in history. His research interests include modern Germany, particularly during the Cold War, as well as environmental history and concepts of space. And Trip will take it from here.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for that introduction, Kevin. Like Kevin said, I am the graduate fellow here at the LePage Center, and I'm going to be moderating today's discussion, as well as introducing our wonderful speaker, Aaron Bentley here. Again, I want to welcome everyone to the last Lunch at LePage event of this fall semester. And I want to thank everyone and our speakers' time for taking this time out of our day and join us on this Zoom. Aaron Bentley is a biodiversity specialist and programs coordinator at the Center for Biodiversity and Conservation at the American Museum of Natural History. Aaron's work and research has spanned many disciplines, from molecular and cellular biology to conservation biology to environmental history and more. With an emphasis on bridging connections across disciplines, Aaron has conducted important research in conservation biology and contributed to fascinating exhibits such as Our Global Kitchen, Food, Nature, Culture, and Water, H2O equals life. As part of Women in the Natural Sciences chapter at the museum, Aaron launched Untold Stories, a project that highlights stories of underrepresented groups and their contributions to scientific knowledge. Currently, Aaron works remotely for the museum and has found a home just down the road from us here at Villanova as we kind of bring this story to a more local scope. She has researched other local histories in the area, such as Idinley, a local history of influential women in the early 20th century in Ballackinwood. She has recently been elected as well as the vice president of the Lower Marion Historical Society. I will now turn it over to Erin for her presentation. This will last about 30-35 minutes. I might have a few follow-up questions right after, and then we will open up the floor to questions from the audience. So if you have questions during the presentation, just be sure to keep those written down, and then we'll use the reactions to kind of get through any unresolved questions and threads. So I'll hand it over to you, Erin.
Thanks, Trip. And I wanted to confirm, can you see my screen? Can you see my screen?
It's blank right now.
Okay, yeah.
It's a blank screen right now.
I'm not sure what happened, so I'm going to reshare. Just give me a minute. Let's try that.
That looks good.
Can you see that now? Okay, good. It went black for me too. So, all right. Thank you. Thank you to Villanova University, the Albert LePage Center for History and the Public Interest for extending the invitation for this Lunch at LePage event, and to Paul and Kevin and Tripp for facilitating this, and to all of you for spending your lunchtime with me. So we'll spend the next 35 minutes or so talking about some very compelling history that has not only been, I'm not sure why that's coming up. Something seems to be happening with the Zoom co-host function. So maybe if folks are trying to chat, maybe don't try. If it keeps happening, I'll reshare. So as I was saying, some compelling history that's been forgotten in our community, but it's history that can teach us about what it means for communities to be resilient in changing times. And it can even inspire us today as we face a climate changed future. And so in this presentation, I'll explain to you what I mean by that. This history also directly relates to a very hyper local issue for you because it's very close to your campus. It's the ongoing issue related to the Lower Marion School District's purchase in 2018 of 2 properties that are adjacent to natural lands, Stoneleigh, a natural garden. So what I thought I would do before we would start is I wanted to see a show of hands of how many of you have visited Stoneleigh as a natural garden. And I'll scan down just to see if you have been there. Anyone? One person. Susan. A few. Okay, great. A few. And how many of you have any knowledge about this particular issue related to Lower Marion School District and the properties that are adjacent to Stoneleigh? Any other hands? A few hands. Okay, that's great. That's helpful. It gives me context for kind of how much background I think I might need to provide to help us understand this issue. So I'm going to stop sharing and reshare so we don't see the hello in the middle of all my slides. Hang on a second. Okay. That looks clean. Okay, great. So I'll just say in the work that we do with the American Museum of Natural History, it's common to start with a land acknowledgement, especially when you're talking about a particular place. And as I assume many of you know, land acknowledgements are heard more commonly in places like Canada or Australia that have had truth and reconciliation commissions looking at the history of the land and its people. And you're starting to hear more and more of it as well in the US. So I hope many of you have heard this before. When done carefully, land acknowledgement can be a powerful way of showing respect for and honoring the Indigenous people on the land on which we live and work. So I want to start this presentation by acknowledging the Lenape people on whose traditional and ancestral homelands we are now located, and recognize the long-standing significance of these lands for Indigenous peoples past, present, and future. Shortly, I'll explain why someone with my background is talking to you about this today, and I'll give you an outline for the plan of the presentation. But before we do that, I just wanted to get us oriented. So this is a map that was taken from a front page, top of fold article in the Philadelphia Inquirer a few weeks ago. It's called "Storied Mainline Estate Becomes a Battleground." And I'll mention this article focused on an eminent domain aspect of this issue that is important, but I argue, in my opinion, it's a distraction from the most pressing aspects of the story that are facing our community right now. So just to orient you, here's your campus, and across the street are Stoneleigh's 42 acres, and adjacent to Stoneleigh is this shape you'll see up here. It's what's labeled Oakwell, and this equals 13.4 acres. And I have a critique of this map because it's misleading. Because those 13.4 acres are actually 2 completely separate properties. So 10 acres of what has been known as Oakwell since 1922. And then there's a 3-acre property that I'll call the Superintendent's Cottage property. And you'll understand why at the end of this talk, why I give it that label. And these 2 separate properties used to be part of what was once the original 65 total acres of the Stoneleigh Estate that was owned by the the Bodine family from Villanova. And we'll get to know this family and what they did with those 13 acres very well in the next 30 minutes. So folks may have seen these signs around your campus in 2018. This was when Lower Marion School District was eyeing the 42 acres of Stoneleigh to build athletic fields for a new middle school. Despite Stoneleigh being protected by a conservation easement, Lower Marion was prepared to use eminent domain. So there was a huge community grassroots pushback, legislation was signed, Lower Marion School District pivoted to Oakwell. And so now this is why you see these signs up around town for preserving and saving Oakwell. So what is going on here? This is that familiar shape that you saw on this map in the newspaper article. This is an aerial view of the landscape. What is Lower Marion planning for this place? They are planning bus accessible parking, a baseball field, a softball field, multi-use fields for soccer, field hockey, and lacrosse for 7th and 8th graders at the new Black Rock Middle School that was constructed just up the block from this area. So in a nutshell, that's the issue that we're talking about today. And here's the plan for kind of the rest of the talk. So I'll introduce myself and give you context about why I'm talking about what is now a sprawling historical research project that changes by the day. I'll share the most compelling aspects of my historical research to date about this special place and the people who once called it home. And I'll try to link past, present, and future in ways that I hope will open up more questions and kind of discussion and your ideas, considering the expertise of those of you who are on the call. This is not a report on a finished project. This is a desire to share findings kind of as they're coming in, including some as recently as like yesterday, and an attempt to build something within our shared community. So I'll introduce myself to answer your questions about why me, why now. I've always been interested in the natural world and science. I was trained as a conservation biologist. I'm fortunate to have spent the past 15 years with the American Museum of Natural History. I live in Ballackinwood and I work remotely. What does a conservation biologist do? So in my case, that's field research on salmon and sea turtles. Most of my talks are usually on those, not on this. I've been fortunate to research exhibitions on topics of food and water. I develop educational materials on conservation. I teach at Columbia University. And these two key things that I think have pulled me so strongly into this research. So thinking about what it means for people to be connected to the places where they live, and researching and sharing stories about people who have been underrepresented in the sciences through the project we mentioned before called Untold Stories. And I mention all this because the work I'm talking about now is outside the scope of the work I do at the museum. This is my spare time stuff I do at night. But it's very much informed by the training and the lessons I have learned from tremendous mentors along the way. And I've always been interested in history and genealogy and asking for stories, but I am not a historian. But I am interested in the intersections between the conservation of biodiversity and history, and how amazing to find a place in my own community that bring all of this together and more. And so I love research. I love to ask questions about the world and build collaborations to try to answer those questions. So I am collaborating with several historians who are advising me, and they have told me this is a story worth telling, and it hasn't been told before. So I'm giving this presentation to those of you on the Zoom to hope you can help me interpret this evidence I found, correct me, through this project. I'm very much learning as I go. And so I'm really grateful to have this opportunity to share it with you. I want to share my intellectual interest in this issue, and maybe that can help us kind of guide this research forward. So museums and the academic discipline of conservation biology, and pretty much anyone doing conservation around the world right now, we're all having a major reckoning with history and colonialism, and my work is at the center of that. So I wanted to share some examples of what I mean by this. Last year, one of my colleagues, a former colleague, Dr. Monique Scott, spoke with you as part of your annual series on decolonizing history. And she mentioned the statue here of Theodore Roosevelt that used to be outside our museum for generations. And it's been the center of debate and controversy for many years. On the left is the statue before it was removed. And on the right, this was taken by a colleague a few days ago. There's a plaque where it once stood. And there's a whole separate side story about what's going on there, but very tangible evidence of this happening at the museum. On the top is our Pacific Northwest Coast Hall. This is the oldest gallery in the museum. It was designed by anthropologist Franz Boas. It was renovated recently with Indigenous co-curators who confronted the racism in these halls head on and asked, why is there cultural heritage in the collections of this museum? What does that mean? What does that mean, right? And I'll also share this. Colleagues at Pitt Rivers Museum are leading an essential project called Labeling Matters, and they're looking at language that we use every day in museum labels and everywhere else, and the harms that this language causes and has caused and can cause. And so these are the questions that I ask in my work, and it's amazing to do it in my neighborhood too. Whose stories are told and remembered? Who is telling those stories? And whose stories are forgotten or even disappeared? And why? Why is that happening? And so what does this have to do with Stoneleigh? I'm going to be sharing with you stories that have been forgotten in our community over time, and I'm interested in knowing why. And I'm interested in knowing what that means for us right now. and what it tells us about kind of what the future might hold for us. So I visited this place that was on those maps in February 22, and I did not understand what I was seeing. What was the purpose of the structures there built around the turn of the century into the 1920s? They're hiding away on this property. Why was the landscape shaped the way it was? How old were the trees? I just was filled with questions. And so I tried to answer them. And this is a very busy slide, but this is how I tried to piece together an untold story. And I'm trying to give you a sense for, this is visiting cemeteries, this is visiting historical archives, this is doing census research, the kind of stuff I assume is second nature to all of you. And it's so exciting for me to do this. It's like data. Oh my goodness, historical research, I love it. So let's go back to some maps. Here's a contrast between the current landscape on the left, the middle school at the top. And if you wanted to walk from the middle school to Stoneleigh, this is how you would go. And this is the estate as it was in 1920 on the right. So this is an atlas. So at the bottom are Samuel Bodine Stoneleigh, the 65 acres. And it's adjacent to Morris Clothier's much larger Claremont estate, right? And this will factor in later in the talk. So these two properties are an essential piece of the story. Here are some atlases I traced through time between 1877 and 1961. The blue shaded boxes are those 13.4 acres that are of interest to us. So going back to Ellis Ramsey and his family, he was a hotel keeper and a farmer. And then it was purchased by Edmund Smith and his family, who was a railroad executive. You know, this is the story of Lower Marion, right? And then it was purchased by Samuel Bodine and his family at the turn of the century. He was an executive with the United Gas Improvement Company. And I wanted to point out this forested part of the parcel up here on this left corner, top left corner. It's still forested to this day. So this is shown forested in 1877. There's a newspaper article I found in 1885 that talks about 10 acres of fine woodland. How amazing is that? So the trees on this property they provide valuable ecosystem services to your campus, like stormwater retention. They're on land that's been forested for quite a while. You know, can we go back farther than that? Are there ways to figure out how long this corner has been forested? You know, we can trace the deeds back to the Welsh Quaker refugees. I have done that. Can we learn more about this land that was, you know, stewarded by the Lenape people for countless generations? You know, what opportunities are there for research? Those are the things that come to mind for me. There's too much information to share in what we're talking about today. So I'm going to focus on these two pieces of the research. So I'm going to focus on the World War I era history of Stoneleigh and the Bodine family. And since this is a group with so much expertise in history, I'm going to take a side trip to before and after the Civil War. And I would love to get your thoughts on some findings that I have that I'm trying to make sense of. So let's rewind 100 years to Stoneleigh in the 1920s. This is a map by Olmsted Brothers. This is the premier landscape architects of the early 20th century. Hopefully they're familiar to many of you. This map shows every inch of Stoneleigh 100 years ago. How did I get this map? Well, the National Park Service, Olmsted Archives, has all the materials from Olmsted Brothers digitized for their thousands of commissions from coast to coast. They're available on Flickr. Guess what else is available? Digitized correspondence in the Library of Congress for the Bodine family of Stoneleigh, correspondence with the Olmsted Brothers firm. Also, digitized correspondence in the Library of Congress for Oakwell. So this was the Bodine family when it carved off Oakwell in 1922, in addition to all of the archives from that property. And then also the same materials for the neighboring Clothier estate I mentioned before, called Claremont. That was also landscaped by Olmsted Brothers. So there are literally hundreds, maybe thousands of materials that I've been looking through, and I would love other people to look through, because this is a gold mine of information. How rich are these data? Here's a sample. This is a 1921 survey of the part of the property that puzzled me a few months ago. This is in the middle is a greenhouse complex. Above it is a superintendent's cottage. Right here is something called the Squirrel Inn. I will talk to you about what that is. And to the left over here is a tea house. And guess what all these dots are? I know you can't use the chat. These dots are individual trees, giving the species name and the diameter at breast height 100 years ago. What could be done with these data? Could we cross-reference these trees with trees on the landscape now? Measure them, calculate a century of tree growth and carbon storage and landscape change? Why, yes, we can. Here's a picture of me starting to collect these data with a utility arborist named Bryce Dorwart and 2 students from the Lower Marion High School Environmental Club. So let's look at this greenhouse complex to the left. Might you be curious about it? I was. Would you like to see a drawing of it in 1903? Here it is. Are you curious about who designed and built it? I was. It was built by Frank Miles Day, noted Philadelphia-based architect, known for his work on college campuses like Princeton and Penn State and the University of Delaware. Has he ever designed something like this before? Not that I can tell. I'd love you to help me answer that question. Why did he design this for the Bodine family? He designed it so the Bodines could win awards at the flower shows. And they won awards. They won a lot of awards for flowers and vegetables. Here is an image of the interior of one of Stoneleigh's greenhouses. These are tomatoes that are being grown interspersed with string beans. Guess what else Frank Miles Day designed? The superintendent's cottage. Again, I would love to know if someone knows about the work of Frank Miles Day and can tell me if he's ever designed anything like this before. I have a whole side story in the superintendents through time, and they're fascinating stories that I can't cover today. But this structure is absolutely adorable and amazing. I wanted to show you some photographs of this Frank Miles Day complex, greenhouse complex from over 120 years ago. This is a picture that's taken from, if you're standing on Stoneleigh, you'd be looking north towards this greenhouse complex. All of this area that's cleared has been reforested, so it's covered and obscured by trees. But this is what that view would have looked like in 1903. Here is another point of view of this greenhouse complex designed by Frank Miles Day. You can see on the left is a carriage house. On the right is one of 2 adorable garden houses. And you see this white oak tree over here on the right. Oops, I'm giving you a preview of what it is. Do you think it's still there? It's a trick question. It's still there. And we measured it. Of course we did. You know, the only way to accurately date the age of a tree is to cut it, but you can measure it and you can calculate, you can use the known growth rate of how a species grows to estimate its age. And so if we had the chat, I would ask you to guess how old do you think this white oak is? Maybe in your head, you can put out a guess and see if it matches. So, you know, based on the measurement, it's between 200 and 250 years old. So the Bodines won awards at the flower shows using the flowers and the vegetables that were produced by the superintendent of Stoneleigh in the facilities that you're seeing here. Then World War I dawned, and the entire purpose of this part of the property shifted. Why did it shift? William Bodine, who was, a young man at this time, was fighting in the Mexican Border War in 1916 and 1917, and then World War I with the 149th Field Artillery Battery A. Captain Bodine was recommended to receive the American Distinguished Service Cross for gallant conduct in standing on top of his battery exposed to the enemy's fire, and coolly directing the suppression of a fire which had broken out in the camouflage. So he was wounded in action just days before the war's end, and he later served in the National Guard, achieved the rank of lieutenant colonel. According to his obituary, he also was awarded the Silver Star, Purple Heart, Legion of Merit, and the Croix de Guerre. What was happening back at home while William Bodine was fighting in Europe? Through newspapers, we learned that in 1917, his father, Samuel T. Bodine, the executive, was a leader of the Mainline Community War Garden Committee. Wow. This committee organized donations of unused land 1 mile north and south of the railroad from Marion to Villanova, along with the seed and the equipment and the labor to sustain the community through wartime shortages. We learn on the bottom here that as their high school studies were wrapping up for the year, young women in Philadelphia were registering for farm work over the summer, planting, cultivating, pickling, and canning foods. I found separately that by May 1917, over 400 acres had been planted from Marion to Villanova as the committee was working in conjunction with the National Emergency Food Garden Commission in Washington, D.C. Guess what was happening at Stoneleigh? I don't have the chat. In your head, guess what was happening at Stoneleigh? The Bodines were creating something amazing. What is this amazing thing? This is the first tip-off I found of what this amazing thing was. In 1920, Eleanor Bodine placed this ad in the bulletin of the National Women's Farm and Garden Association. And I'll read it. Mrs. Samuel T. Bodine, her name was Eleanor Bodine, of Villanova, Pennsylvania, was offering an opportunity to 6 women who have adopted gardening as a profession to supplement their theoretical training by the practical training of actual work in greenhouses and gardens under her capable superintendent, Mr. Alexander McLeod. She will pay to those whom she accepts $20 per month in addition to board and lodging during the spring, summer, and autumn of 1920. I won't go on, but this means the same year, 1920, that women finally received the right to vote. Eleanor Bodine was recruiting college-age women for Stoneleigh's gardening and horticultural training program through, and this was an ad with the Women's Educational and Industrial Union that's headquartered in Boston. So what does this mean? It means Stoneleigh was the center of an innovative training program for young women using the facilities at Stoneleigh. Here's another example of what this means. The year before, in May 1919, Eleanor Bodine welcomed to her gardens fellow members of the newly founded Women's National Farm and Garden Association, which was having a conference at nearby Bryn Mawr College. So this is the proceedings of that day. All of these people speaking are very notable. They wrapped up their day, and then what happened? They went to Stoneleigh and took a tour of the program that the Bodines had built at Stoneleigh. Yes, and so I gave away the headline, but this is listed here. This is Miss Samuel T. Bodine in Villanova was hosting a tour of several properties in Lower Marion. They were the last one of the day. And here is the evidence that links all of this together. This is a 1926 article in House and Garden magazine, and I'll read the first part of it for you. In those days of the war, the lawn was turned into a large vegetable tract from which the poor people in the neighborhood received their supply of fresh vegetables, and that 8 or 9 girls were employed as assistants in the gardens. So this is what Stoneleigh was. I did an exhibition 10 years ago at the American Museum of Natural History on food, and we used these World War I era posters for our exhibition. These are part of the U.S. Department of Agriculture special collection. So this was what Stoneleigh was in Lower Marion. How amazing is that? It's pretty amazing. And you might ask, like, how did this program work? I wanted to know. And what I found is that in 1916, the Bodine family built a dormitory for these women. Let's go back to that key piece of evidence I read before. They were housed in a building originally intended for 4 horses and tool sheds, but suitably retrofitted for them. One of the girls possessed a keen sense of humor and named the abode Squirrel Inn. The sobriquet still clings to it. So who wants to see Squirrel Inn? Because it's still there. It's on property that's adjacent to what's now owned by the Lower Marion School District. Here it is. It's a charming 1916 house. Here you see the Olmsted Brothers maps that talk to you about the Squirrel Inn dormitory. It was built as a dormitory. This is a picture I took a few weeks ago from what used to be the chicken run, and it was right next to where the pigs were. So this is all happening in this intact landscape. Where were these gardens that the women were tending? And so the Olmsted Brothers materials answer that question. I used the Google Earth landscape features to estimate the extent of these gardens at about 2.5 acres. And then through oral history of the Bodine family that has come about through connections I've made with the Bodine family, we learned that there was a vegetable garden across Bingrel Road. And I looked back at the Olmsted materials, and yeah, there was a 1-acre vegetable garden that was also producing food for this community across Bingrel Road. And here's a picture of what this looks like if you're looking across the metal fence to Stoneleigh. So you can stand next to this greenhouse complex. This is the landscape that made no sense to me in February. You can look across that and you see those were gardens. Those were gardens that were being tended by women and that were feeding our community in a time of war and hardship. They've been hiding there in plain sight ever since. How amazing is that? Who were the women tending these gardens? I want to know. I'm working on it. I found one of them. This is her. This is Wellesley College student Wilhelmina Josephate. And incidentally, Frank Miles Day designed Founders Hall at Wellesley College. But she was living there in 1917. So this is an address that was listed in the Penn alumni directory. So I'm trying to figure out what was going on there. But Wilhelmina was living in Squirrel Inn and was part of this program that was designed by the Bodines. Other hints, the scope of this operation. So newspapers reveal that in 1920, Eleanor Bodine hosted a summer garden tour that was organized by the Pennsylvania School of Horticulture for Women at Ambler. This was the first school of its kind in the United States. It's now Temple University Ambler. And I've reached out to loop them in and to ask if they can look through their archives to get more evidence on this. And so this same year is 1920. This is where William Bodine had returned from the war. The family subdivided Stoneleigh to make Oakwell. And this was a home for his young family. He had 2 young sons when this house, the mansion at Oakwell, was built in 1920. The tea house I mentioned before, it's a bit of a mystery. I could use some help. It was built sometime between 1900 and 1906. It looks very different from the Frank Miles Day stuff. Well, I'm not really sure what to make of that. And I bring it up because at the neighboring Claremont Estate, the Olmsted brothers built 2 summer houses in 1919. And because of the richness of the data here, I have sketches of them, photos of them, maps of them. This was something a lot of families had kind of for outdoor entertaining, right? What became of these summer houses? Well, they're not there anymore because there's a middle school there. The Black Rock Middle School was built on the Claremont Estate. And I have a picture that was in a newspaper article in 2019 of this Olmsted Brothers summer house, overgrown and underappreciated, right? We don't even know what was lost. Some people do. A lot of people understood the conversion of Claremont to Black Rock Middle School and what that meant, but this is something that I didn't know about. And I've shared it with the National Association for Olmsted Parks because there are organizations that work to preserve the legacy of Frederick Law Olmsted Sr. and Olmsted Brothers all across the nation because they are very impactful, right? So just an example of kind of how far this can reach. Let's take a side trip to some of the other people who called this home other than the Bodines and the women in the program. So I use census data to trace everyone who lived here. And because I'm a nerd, I made a table and you can't read it. I realize this, but these are laborers, farmhands, gardeners, cooks, waitresses, parlor maids, chambermaids, coachmen, nurses. They're immigrants from Ireland, Sweden, France, Scotland, England, Germany, Poland, and Canada. This is a photo of Annie Tater, who along with her mother, Martha, immigrated from Germany. They were Oakwell's cook and nurse, and they cared for William and Angela Bodine's 4 children. The petition for their US citizenship, I wanted to mention this, it required them to renounce the German Reich. So this was in 1930, right? So there's so many layers of history that I'm trying to pull out. Let's go farther back in time to this side history here to other people who called this place home from the census years of 1850, 1860, and 1870. This is the 1870 census of this 65-acre property when it was owned by Ellis Ramsey. It had 3 employees, including 19-year-old farmhand Sandy Kennedy. He's listed as Black. He's recorded as unable to read or write. He was born in Tennessee in 1851, which means he was born enslaved to parents who were enslaved. He was born 1 year after the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act, which means during his childhood, the federal government was responsible for returning people seeking freedom to their enslavers, even if they were in a free state. The surname of Kennedy may be a clue to where his family was enslaved prior to the Civil War. This is of interest to me, and I don't know what I'm doing. So I'd love someone to help me figure out how we can trace this to one of the 40 different enslavers in Tennessee with the last name of Kennedy that are listed in the 1850 slave schedule. Hang on. The Ramsey family that employed Sandy Kennedy to work on their 65-acre farm sent 2 sons to fight in the Civil War. You're seeing a picture of First Lieutenant Theodore F. with the 15th Pennsylvania Cavalry Regiment. And there was his brother, Corporal William Horn, the 1st Pennsylvania Cavalry 44th Regiment. Let's look at the 1850 census. This is another aspect that I could really use some help with. This is, again, the Ellis Ramsey family, and they had 2 employees at this time, including one whose name was Jacob Ganges. And this is where I want to pause. And if that name rings a bell for anyone, I would love for a hand. I'm going to scan down. I don't see any hands. Okay. So I'll just say real quickly, he appears in the 1850 and the 1860 census. He was biracial. His occupation was listed as a hostler. So he was caring for the horses at Ellis Ramsey's Green Tree Hotel. This was a few blocks away from the family farm. He was also unable to read or write, though a decade later, he's marked as literate. And Ellis Ramsey, and he had 5 children attending school at this time, including a son who later became a school teacher. So I wonder, did they share their lessons with the man who works their farm? But it's the surname that caught my attention when I first looked at the census a few months ago, because it's distinctive for this time and place. And it's distinctive because it means his mother was among the 135 enslaved Africans aboard the ships Phoebe and Prudent, who were rescued off the coast of Cuba by the USS Ganges in 1800 and brought to Philadelphia to be placed under the guardianship of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society and indentured throughout our area. Each freed African person received the surname Ganges, named for the river flowing from the Himalayas into the Bay of Bengal, and the namesake of the warship that saved them and their children from a lifetime of enslavement on the sugar plantations of the Caribbean. So I could use help with this. How do I know this? There's a project tracing the descendants of the Ganges family in the Philadelphia area. I have reached out with my findings. We'll see where this goes. This is an image from the project that shows where the members of the Ganges family, taken from these ships off the coast of Cuba, where they were indentured, and there were several in Lower Marion. So rich opportunity for so much inquiry and scholarship. I welcome anyone who can help me with this. So quickly, I just want to say, what does all this history mean for Lower Marion School District's plan for this place? And maybe you are thinking what I was thinking when I realized the forgotten history of Stoneleigh. This intact, biodiverse landscape is a tremendous opportunity for research and for learning and for education. Because part of what is forgotten about this place was that 100 years ago, women were being trained in gardening and horticulture. It was an educational space. And it was also feeding the community as part of a broader mobilization effort during World War I. So here's yet another description of the program in a magazine that I found. Another opportunity for training offered by Eleanor Bodine of Villanova. Extensive state eminent superintendent have formed an exceptional combination. Young girls are received here for practice and instruction. They're paid while they're learning. They have model housing accommodations. In this same article is a quote that I think opens up possibilities, right? This is a quote that I read to the Lower Marion High School Environmental Club when I met with them several weeks ago and we started collaborating on this historical research and more. And I'll just read it. So this is a 100-year-old article that talks about Stoneleigh. Nature study classes and school gardens are awakening special powers of observation and emphasizing the practical value of patience and diligent perseverance. Public and private enterprise must combine to throw searchlights onto the path to be chosen, revealing the mysteries of science related to horticulture, because even soil teems with history, science, poetry, and religion. So can we take inspiration from our collective past to build our collective future? The students I'm working with in Lower Marion say yes, and they are showing us the way forward. How are they doing this? With a proposal that they developed with my support over the past month. They presented it last week to the Lower Marion School Board. 12 speakers in coordinated and inspiring presentations made the case for this presentation and more. And I think we'll share the links to their presentation and their proposal afterwards through email and through questions. I'm happy to share more about it. But basically, they see the potential opportunity. Can the rest of our community see this potential opportunity? And I want to just say, why am I doing this? I'm doing this for the students in Lower Marion and beyond, and for my daughters who are at Kinwood Elementary School, because their future keeps me up at night. And we need to build in climate resilience to every aspect of our lives. And so we're drawing inspiration from this amazing anthology and this quote from, feminist poet and essayist Adrienne Rich, which I also had the students read. My heart is moved by all I cannot save. So much has been destroyed. I have to cast my lot with those who age after age perversely and with no extraordinary power reconstitute the world. And so I'll end quickly with some acknowledgements, but I want to say, do you want to come see this place? Because we are doing tours, the groups that are trying to, let people know in the community about what this place is and its ecological significance and its historical significance. And so there are tours that are being run, and I have trained folks to give this tour, and all the materials that I've shared with you today are available. And I'll say my acknowledgements in terms of friends and neighbors and experts, very generous with their time, colleagues at the museum, my children and my husband who have put up with me for the last few months. This is us on a recent visit to Oakwell where we were measuring trees together. And it's their future that is, driving all of my work in terms of this project itself. And so I'll end with my contact information and just a picture of the atlas that kind of started all this. And when I first laid eyes on this property and this amazing door knocker that's on the 1920 mansion that was designed by William Wayne. And there's so much history here that I could really use some help. So I'd love to open this up for questions from Tripp and from others in the audience, and I'll stop sharing for now.
Erin, thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. Really exciting to be able to learn a little bit more specifically about what is so, Dr. Roger said, hyper local. It is across the street. And being from Texas, I moved up here for this program, and so I had no idea. And it's so great to kind of find ways, even through history, to kind of, build into that community building that the Oakwell Estate is known for. And so to be able to maybe share this knowledge and work towards some preservation. So I do have some questions. I guess first off, when you kind of mentioned this with your background as working with the Natural Science Museum and then or Natural History Museum, and your kind of background is a biologist and a conservation biologist, definitely. But how do you find this kind of interplay between disciplines of natural science and history, kind of either in your methods and what you do, or maybe kind of presentation of research and things like that?
Such a good question. Thank you, Tripp. Yeah, this is the heart of my interest. And I didn't even realize it until a few years ago, right? There's this, as I said, this reckoning happening in conservation, in biodiversity conservation, and history. I mean, frankly, your annual history series is the same, right? We're all having this reckoning about what it means, what are we studying? How are we trained? What is the work we're trying to do? And so my work at the Center for Biodiversity and Conservation has followed that arc through time. And so, we have worked with communities and trying to figure out what's important. And we call it biocultural approach. So it's what's important to the communities and how they can manage their natural resources. And do they need us coming in telling them what to do? Do they, so we grapple with that all the time, right? And so, I've worked all over the world. We work in Solomon Islands, we work in the Pacific, we work in South America. I'm working with USAID right now on some larger questions about their biodiversity programming all over the world. And so it's so interesting that the work I do in my day job resonates so powerfully with what's happening in Lower Marion too, because it's the same thing. How are we managing land? Who's making decisions? What are the power dynamics? What's the history involved there? It's like this kind of systems thinking approach that we've been integrating into our work in conservation. And I'll have to say, the way I was trained as a conservation biologist was as a biological science, but I should have been trained in social science. And a lot of people recognize that, right? Conservation at its heart is a social science, right? And we weren't trained to do that properly. And so we need to be thinking about education and how that needs to be framed on many different levels. And that's what's exciting about the work with Lower Marion schools, these students, because they get it. They understand how important it is that they get the education they could have at this place that they're calling the Action Center for Organizing Resilience and Natural Sustainability Education. How do you build in resilience for a climate change future? Those questions are being asked all over the world, and they relate to Lower Marion too, and so I think there's some universal themes here that are very interesting to me, but also I feel it's important for our community to kind of be asking those questions, right? What does it mean when we look at these climate projections for our future and the future of our kids, right? So I don't know if that answered your question, but those are the things that I'm thinking about in terms of how the work that I do, how there's feedback between the work that I do at the museum and the research I'm doing for this project.
Certainly, no, thank you so much. That definitely answers kind of that approach, and then also presentation, and then it just thinking as, you know, coming into a new discipline or kind of bridging those gaps between disciplines and how we approach these very difficult topics. It can be global in scope and also hyper local, next door, things like that. Our most recent climate change annual event series was all about climate justice and activism. And there's definitely that kind of movement for both local and global simultaneously. So thank you for speaking on that. I have many more questions, but I would really love to open it up to the floor first and see if anyone else in the audience has anything, whether specifically about research, you know, this conversation, or maybe what we could be doing. So if we could just use that raise hand function on the reactions, and we can go from there. All right, looks like John. Yes.
Great, thank you, Trip, and thank you, Aaron, for a very interesting talk and a provocative one. And I really liked your comments at the end, I should say, about the social science aspects of conservation biology. I'm, by the way, a biologist here at Villanova. And I was hoping you could elaborate a little bit on what you're doing with Lower Marion. You mentioned that, and I'm specifically interested in who they made their presentation to and just some of the outcomes and some of the hopes there.
Absolutely. Yeah, I didn't have time to get into that collaboration, and it's pretty new. It's about a month old. So this is happening now as I'm realizing the history, and everyone else is realizing the history at the same time, and trying to feel like what can be done here. So it's a really tangled issue that has to do with local politics, local land use. It has to do with decisions being made by Lower Marion School District, and opposition that they're having from many stakeholders, including the Lower Marion Township, from neighbors like Villanova, from neighbors who live right next to where these turf fields are going to be. I mean, it's such an interesting case study to me, and like local governance and power dynamics and things like that. And I first reached out to the Lower Marion students because I could not keep up with the research, and I really would love someone to help me with it, right? So I reached out to a student who spoke at the last school board meeting, and she spoke with passion about Oakwell. And I reached out to her, and she was president of the Lower Marion Environmental Club at the high school. And she connected me with all of her peers at Lower Marion High School, with Harriton High School, with Black Rock Middle School. And so this collaboration has grown into like the student-led coalition. And it was so clear to me that the leverage point to get Lower Marion School District's attention is the students, right? Like the power of their voices can break through. This has been fought over for years. You know, it is entrenched, and it has to do with who's on the school board and who are the superintendent. And there was a change there recently, right? And so there's a lot of people trying to figure out how to put their vision, how to put their perspective out there. And so what we did with the students was share what the slides I just gave you are basically what I shared with them. And I said, here's what I found. Can you help me with this? And so we spent time on this property. They've seen all these structures. They've done the research with me. They've measured trees, and they understood how valuable this place is for them and those who come after them. And so they, pivoted their entire purpose around like not just kind of fighting against the plan, but is there something people can fight for, which is the most powerful force for change, right? And so we built this proposal, and it has 6 aims. And it basically, it wants to put greenhouse back in the greenhouse complex, because right now there's a tennis court. The Bodine family replaced those greenhouses in the 1920s or 30s with tennis courts. Otherwise, the landscape is intact, but it was producing food 100 years ago. These kids want to put school gardens back in. They want to join the farm to school movement. Like, the sky is the limit. In some ways, I was sitting in their club meetings and it was like, we could do this. We could bring in arts. We could change the curricula. We could grow food. We could use that food and put it in the cafeteria. And guess what? Take the food waste from the cafeteria and fertilize the gardens. Like, they were ahead of me instantly. And I was like, yes, let's do this. Okay, sounds good. And so we turned it in to a proposal. And we have a whole page of collaborators, and we have funding sources because I write grants for a living. And so I instantly am thinking of National Science Foundation and state level funders. And like so much of this has to do with taxpayer money and Lower Marion, using eminent domain and taxpayer money, and the need to have, lots of people move to Lower Marion for the schools. And so the schools are experiencing pressure. And so there's this desire, need to construct new fields and new schools. And so all these things are happening at the same time. But for the students try to drive a reframing in this. So does it have to be a zero-sum thing of like fields versus not fields? Is there something everyone can benefit from? And so the proposal that they put together is this kind of broad collaborative vision, the kind of thing that like we want our children to do. Like, Lower Marion educated these kids and look what they did. Like, this proposal is just so inspiring. And we're hearing every day of people who are reading it. Riverbend Environmental Center sent an email to them yesterday saying, can we be part of this? Like, it's exactly that kind of grassroots effort. And the issue is Lower Marion going to make a pivot? Does Lower Marion School District understand what they have here, this opportunity? What can happen? So I don't know. You guys are part of it. Like, we have a front row seat here. I don't know what's going to happen. I really hope that pivot happens. I hope these children can break through this framing. And so I'm going to stop talking. I don't know if that answered your question, Sean.
You did, and thank you. And your answer really conveyed a lot of the excitement around this, and it's really an awesome initiative. Thank you.
All right. Anyone else? Questions? Erin, I really appreciated that kind of the talks of grassroots, the power of, to bringing communities together, bringing kind of these disparate voices, and also in your research and kind of this focus on untold stories or like stories forgotten. It's really exciting to see opportunities that we're able to bring that out and be able to showcase those stories.
And I'll just mention part of the reasons why there's so much potential here is the place itself carries the history, right? Like, you can study the history of Lower Marion and your community through the lens of Stoneleigh and Oakwell and how that connects with, Philadelphia and more broadly. And so, I think, it could be powerful as a model. This is something that's in the proposal. Like, we need a transformation in K through 12 education, right? And the next generation science standards and state standards are trying to make a pivot towards climate change. A lot of institutions are trying to make that pivot. How do they do that, right? And so Lower Marion could be at the forefront of something that needs to happen across the country. And one thing I shared with the students is there are 18 school districts in the United States that have accredited arboretums. How many of those accredited arboretums also have community gardens? 0. So, there is an opportunity for something that is not, that creating something new and powerful, and the students can see how these things can integrate together, and can they bring the community along with them on this vision? But it is the kind of thing where if Lower Marion wants to, have a national profile, this is one way you could do that. Like, you could turn these into fields and make sure that softball, baseball, and soccer and all these, students get to play that. Or you could see that as a solvable logistics problem because there's a lot of existing fields around, and kind of put that issue to the side, and then see the tremendous opportunity that you have with this 13.4 acres that no one understood the significance of it when they bought it. Nobody did. Everyone I talked to, and even Natural Lands, Stoneleigh doesn't know the World War I history of the Bodine family. So, this is not stuff that was kind of known within the community, right? And so all of us are realizing, oh, wow, there's a lot more here than we even knew. what are the opportunities? What are the potential ways to transform that in different ways throughout the community?
Definitely. I love this reframing of not explicitly antagonistic. It is about productive opportunities for this space, both historically, ecologically, environmentally, and then just like for the students, and then this like very potentially productive space beyond fields. I believe we did have a hand up previously. If we still have that question, that would be great. If not, that's okay.
I think it was Adam.
Yeah. Hi, Aaron.
Hi.
My connection may not be great, and I cut out a little bit during your talk, but what I saw was excellent. Thanks for that. And I was curious about what you said about, well, conservation biology being really a social science, and I've started to think that more and more about my own field, ecology, and more broadly biology. The pandemic really hit home the point that science will only take us so far, right? We had a silver bullet, but there was just a communication issue that prevented us from, that prolonged the pandemic. Same thing with climate change. I feel like we've known all we need to know for the past 30 years. Science is progressing, and it's just the political will and social will to put it to use is really what our main hindrance. But this whole watching Oakwell and seeing the students' responses, it's just it's unlike anything I've seen in like the broader climate movement, at least locally. Like, I just don't see people get as excited or as inspired about the globe as I do about this one little forest that's not that big in the whole scheme of things, though it is beautiful and it is old, and I think pretty unique around here. I just wanted to, I guess it's just more of a comment, but do you see that, how much more utility do you think science has in trying to solve these kinds of problems? Like, in your perspective, from a conservation biologist perspective?
Adam, that is such a good question. I think about it every day. Yes, there's a few things here. So I would say, yes, I think a lot of us realize that it's not just we need more information, better information. We need to translate, like figure out what that information means for people making decisions about whatever at any scale, right? And so we think in my work at the Center for Biodiversity and Conservation, we work across scales. So, there's all this global policy happening with sustainable development goals, and COP is happening. And, there's these larger mechanisms and, globalization that is driving large system levels changes. But where do people feel connected? They connected to where they live. Like that's what matters. That's where your family is. That's, those are the things that I think are powerful. So in the work we do with communities, we ask very purposefully, like, do you need our expertise for this? Like, how can we support your decision-making about your community, right? And your agency in that, and what tools you need. And so it's kind of like a reframing. I think for a lot of conservation, it's been like, you're going to go somewhere and study some really cool stuff and publish it. Are you going to share that with the community? Are you sharing the research with the community and helping them figure out what it means for their community? Or is it, you're going to publish it and then move on to the next phase in your academic career? So it's like a larger question about like, what are we doing? What is the purpose of conservation? There's an entire really unfortunate history about protected areas and who is excluded. What is the purpose of a protected area? So right now there's a big push by Biden for 30 by 30 across the world. There's a half Earth movement. We're going to protect these areas. What does that mean? Who has been stewarding these areas for generations? What does this new protection mean for them? And so, I'll mention that. I'll also mention just in terms of the global kind of conversation happening. So the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, also known as IPBES, has been trying to kind of figure this out through a series of, global assessments, regional assessments, local assessments. And they recently put out a values assessment, right? And I think this document is really powerful because it looks at how are our values driving the change we're seeing around the world, right? And do we need to look at a values level assessment of what those drivers are? And I would argue yes. And that's something where, my scientific training is not going to help me understand values level mental model changes that need to happen. But, it's something where the students I'm working with, they get it. They understand, the power of asking those big questions and unpacking assumptions about looking around the world and why it is that we're in a biodiversity and climate crisis. What are the historical reasons for that? What are the political reasons for that? And what can you do in your local community to make change? Because the students feel empowered. They understand this is something I can do. They feel, a lot of us feel anxiety and grief and trying to understand what the future means. And so one way you can channel that, and there's an entire scholarship on the psychology of climate anxiety, but one way you can do it is to get involved in your community and share, build, create. And so that's what these students are doing, which is can they bring us along with this? And this is how they're processing their understanding. And me too. This is something that I'm doing for my children, basically. So that was a long answer. Sorry, Adam.
Thank you. No, it's, on the one hand, it's I feel kind of like this is a little, one criticism could be this is just NIMBYism. It's this one old rich guy's estate that we're trying to save. But I say, to heck with that. It's everybody should try to save what they can. And this, as we're in a biodiversity crisis, I feel like that's a distraction. Save. Yeah. I wish everybody had that same passion for every acre of forest.
Thank you for that question, Adam, and that wonderful response, Aaron. I believe we have time for one more question or comment from Dr. Rozier.
Well, I really just want to take this opportunity to thank Trip for moderating the discussion and Aaron for your time and your passion and your commitment to this important space. And if you have a few minutes to stay on the Zoom, Trip, Kevin, and I would like to talk about how the LePage Center can help you with the project. I'd also encourage all of the members of the audience to send an email to lepage@villanova.edu if you would like some additional information about Aaron's work. We have a bunch of really informative links that we can share with you that will help you keep up to date on this project, which is evolving every day, as you say. So thanks again, Aaron. Fantastic. From a historical perspective, someone who teaches environmental history, all of this is just fascinating to me. So I look forward to further collaboration with you.
Thank you. It was my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me. This really meant a lot to be able to share this with you, and I'm excited to see where it can go.
And thanks to Sam Chapman and Adam for introducing us to you. And thanks everyone for attending, and be sure to check the website for our future events in the spring. We've got a lot of great stuff ahead of us.